بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيدات والسادة الحضور، مساكم الله بالخير. حياكم الله في ندوة جديدة من ندوات منتدى جدة الاقتصادي. عنوان ندوتنا اليوم مواطنة مزدهرة الطبقة الوسطى في المملكة العربية السعودية. المتحدثون في هذه الندوة هم على التوالي السيد غسان الكبسي، شريك تنفيذي في شركة ماكنزي اند كمباني، وصاحب السمو الملكي الأمير تركي الفيصل، رئيس مجلس إدارة مركز الملك فيصل للبحوث والدراسات الإسلامية، والدكتور أبو بكر باقادر الأكاديمي السعودي أستاذ علم الاجتماع. نبدأ بالأستاذ غسان، لديه كلمة عن مستقبل المعيشة في السعودية، فليتفضل. أتمنى على السادة المتحدثين أن لا تطول كلماتهم عن 7 دقائق، لتكن فضلا منهم بين 5 و7 دقائق حتى نترك مجال أكثر للنقاش.
Your Royal Highnesses, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I must say it's probably one of the most difficult things is to follow His Excellency the Prime Minister of Turkey on this stage. It is an impossible act to follow, so there will be absolutely no attempt to following it. So forgive me for the quite difference in performance that you will actually see. Now, so far today and yesterday, you heard a lot of the speakers highlighted the important global trends and their effects on the GCC and Saudi Arabia. Now, one of the most important outcomes of a nation's progress is the prosperity of its people. That is based on opportunities that they have to fulfill their hopes and their ambitions. Today, I have been asked to shed some light on the trajectory of economic prosperity in the kingdom over the next 20 years. In doing so, I would like to pose 3 choices that we would have in how we create this future prosperity. And hopefully we can discuss those during the course of the panel. The first question and choice is, do we want our standard of living of the Saudi family over the course of the next 20 years, do we want that to be in the future half or double of what it is today? Because all of these possibilities exist. Today, the various global and local forces are pushing us down a path where we see our standard of living cut by half. In other words, if we take an average Saudi family and calculate their household income in 2030, their ability to provide for their family, to save for the future, to pick services that sometimes are private in nature, will be cut by 50%. They will not have as much luxury in 20 years as they might do today. So why is this the case? There are many reasons, but let me just illustrate 2. First is we have an economy whose job mix pulls us down. Let me explain, and I will share with you just some numbers. Today, there are 4 million Saudis working in Saudi Arabia. Approximately 2.8 million are working in the public sector. Let's just say 3. And 1.2 million are working in the private sector. In the public sector, they represent 90% of, if you will, Saudis are 90% of the employed. And in the private sector, they represent 20%. So these are the 4 million today. Remember, 3 million in the government, 1 million in the private sector. In the next 20 years, there will be 6 million more Saudis looking for opportunities. And that is at a minimum. There could be a bit more. There's about 6 to 8 or so. Let's just assume it's 6. About 1 million of those will find opportunities in the public sector, because the public sector cannot grow, if you will, indiscriminately. It is already large. So you have 5 million other Saudis looking for opportunities that have to find these opportunities in the private sector. However, today, the private sector has low wages. In fact, today, as we speak, the average wages in the private sector altogether is approximately 1,800 riyals per person per month. And for the Saudis that are today in the private sector, their average income is approximately 3,900 riyals per person per month. So as these 5 million people have no place but the private sector of today, we estimate that almost two out of every three, or maybe even 3 out of every 5, 3 million out of the 5 million will end up taking low-wage jobs in the private sector. And that is an important driver of the future prosperity of the Saudi household. The second is that productivity is falling behind the rest of the world. Ultimately, wages follow productivity. The kingdom is lagging many emerging market countries such as Malaysia and Turkey, whose annual improvement in productivity is approximately between 3 and 5%. The kingdom, it has an annual change in productivity of negative 0.5%. That is because of its dominant focus on public sector and low-skill private sector with a limited focus on competitive export industries. So with an economic structure dominated by low-wage jobs and productivity that is low and doesn't improve faster than the cost of living, these factors together are conspiring to make our future uninspiring. Now, no one of us, and I don't think anybody out there, accepts this kind of future for our children. They deserve more as they start to build their lives. We have the opportunity and the ability to double our standard of living rather than see it cut by half. We can create an alternative future with the economy that suits our aspirations and those of our children. That economy has the following ingredients. Now, all of you know these ingredients. Many of you have talked about it many times, but they're still important enough to mention. I'll mention 3 ingredients. Each of them usually contributes a third of the answer. The first, we must boost productivity from minus 0.5% to the average, which is approximately 3 percentage points. Many things affect that, but I'll just pick 2 that are important. Improving education, nobody disagrees that it's important. What was quite surprising to us is that actually, if we improve education so that we move from the bottom of the world, if you will, educational attainment outcomes today, to just the average, not to be the best, just to the average, over the course of the next 10 years, that by itself will help us improve our standard of living by about 30%. So there is a big price tag on getting education right. And without it, we would not achieve this kind of aspiration. Now, education takes some time, and so vocational training is critical for the short and the medium term to bridge the gap between the private sector and the Saudi citizens. These 2 will help productivity move. Second is quality private sector growth. Quality private sector growth. The primary engine for a sustainable economy can only be the private sector. The current trajectory the private sector has is the following. There are about 5 million jobs today in the private sector. These will increase to approximately 13 million jobs over the course of the next 20 years. But of the 7 million jobs that are actually growing, only 2 million are medium wages and above, which is usually above 4,000 riyals per month. Right? Only 2 million are jobs above 4,000 riyals per month. The private sector that we need to actually help the prosperity of our next generation is one that, in addition to these 2 million, can add another 2.5 million jobs, preferably in manufacturing and services, and obviously in small and medium enterprises. Remember, we have 6 million people that we're trying to employ. So the challenge for the private sector is to go from the 1 million, if you will, today, to almost, if you will, 5 million in this sort of medium wage category. That is a challenging aspiration of 4 to 5 times increase. It's not just doubling. Huh? And we have to enable the private sector to do so. Now, having said that, the reality is None of what I just said is new. It has been said many times. It was even said yesterday by Sheikh Saleh Kamel, or I should say Abe Saleh Kamel, in the introductory few remarks. I even went back to the Jeddah Economic Forum proceedings of 2000 and 2001 and checked what the discussions were about, and I'll tell you what, it was very similar. So what are we going to be then discussing in 10 years from now? So that's our second choice. What are we going to be discussing in 10 years from now? Will our discussions be any different from what we discussed in the last decade? Would the next decade be one where we come back and achieve success and celebrate success? Or will we actually just be talking about the same things, only with less confidence in our ability to deliver? Now, extraordinary conditions call for extraordinary action. Our king is the best teacher of that evidence by his own actions. Today, every ministry, every authority, and many large companies and foundations, and even many governors in the kingdom, several of whom are present in the forum, have programs to create opportunities. Some even started more than 5 years ago. Lots of time and energy is spent on these programs, but the results have been, at best, slow and limited in size. In talking to many people leading these programs, they feel that despite the best intentions, these programs aren't as successful because only 10 to 20% of the time and energy that is focused on them enables them to really execute very well. Imagine that. Less than 2 months of the year on a given important project is really productive in pushing that project forward. Less than 2 months of the year. 30 seconds. So if we were to make use of the next decade until we meet here again, we have to make every day count. And the world is full of examples of extraordinary responses and tools. Many countries have set up even important vehicles that report directly to the president or a prime minister that oversee the most important projects in the country. Now, it is up to us to adopt a managerial approach that fits our own extraordinary situation. So in conclusion, I'm reminded by an expression by His Royal Highness Prince Khalid Al Faisal, who says, you need strong will and effective management. Al-irada wal-idara. This summarizes, if you will, our two questions. So the first one is the choice that we have to either cut by half or double our standard of living in the next 20 years. And the second is the choice to adopt ordinary or extraordinary managerial approaches to developing and achieving this ambition. We hope that all of you put your hearts, minds, and hands together here so that we can move forward with this goodwill to our children. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا للأستاذ غسان على هذه الكلمة المهمة. سننتقل الآن إلى صاحب السمو الملكي الأمير تركي الفيصل، رئيس مجلس إدارة مركز الملك فيصل للبحوث والدراسات الإسلامية.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أفضل المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بداية أشكر منظمي منتدى جدة الاقتصادي لدعوتي للمشاركة اليوم، والشكر موصول لكل من حضر. بقيت في حيرة من عنوان الندوة اليوم، المواطنة المزدهرة. I've been in a quandary as to the title of the session today, Prosperous Citizenship. ماذا تعني؟ What does it mean? لن أتطرق لها مثل ما تطرق لها الأخ غسان بالأرقام والإحصائيات، وإنما سأطرح عليكم بعض الأفكار من الوجدان، وأبدأها ب